Hi, I'm Matt Madigan. Welcome to day 24 of my 2022 40-day fast. So glad you could join me here today on YouTube or socials. And I'm answering 40 questions over 40 days around long-term fasting to just celebrate, I guess, my 20th year of doing long-term fasts. Mostly they are normally private fasts. I keep them to myself, but this year God really challenged me to put 40 videos out there and stir up the idea of fasting and what it does. So today's question is, does fasting increase our spiritual empowerment? I touched on this a little bit on a video a few days ago, but I just want to flesh this out a little bit more and particularly look at Mark's Gospel chapter 9, where something happens with Jesus and his disciples, and it gives us an idea of what's happening in Jesus' fasting. So let me just read a little bit to you from that Gospel, and starting verse 14. When Jesus came to the other disciples, they saw there was a large crowd around them and teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with power and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing about?" he asked. The man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought my son who is possessed by a spirit that robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." Now, without understanding the context of what's going on, it's quite a reasonable thing to think, well, they're human, don't always get everything right. But there's two things here to remember. That firstly, Jesus has sent them out with power. So if we bring all the Gospels together to one account, Jesus has already sent them out with his power to have authority over all demonic things. And the second thing is they've gone out there and they've seen it happen. So they've actually been at the pointy end of seeing the demonic flee, and so it's become something that they can do. So what happens here in this passage? They bring a demonized boy to Jesus, to the disciples, and they can't cast it out. And they're sort of like, well, what's going on? And it's a really interesting thing about what's happening in this passage. They had done it before, they'd been commanded and empowered to do it, but they couldn't do it. Well, Jesus goes on to bring a discussion that comes to an end. And as Mark brings this thought to an end, he ends it with this incredible bit where he says, he replied, the reason you couldn't drive it out was because this kind comes out only by prayer and fasting. Now, it says in some versions just by prayer and others fasting. And if you want to have a more full discussion on that, I encourage you to grab my book. There's a whole bunch in there from my master's paper around fasting, around as to why the word fasting should be included in the text. But that is something, if you want to read, you can get on to Amazon and buy that and read it. But what I want to just talk about is this whole idea here that Jesus says something along the lines of that only by prayer and fasting can this come out. But in this text, he does neither. Jesus doesn't stop and say, come back tomorrow, I'm going to do a bit of fasting. He doesn't even pray that the Spirit would come out. He simply commands it. So it's interesting that Jesus would say, this type only comes out or only responds to prayer and fasting, and he does neither in the text. How do we make sense of that? I think we make sense of this by thinking that actually Jesus was living a lifestyle of prayer and fasting, so he had the spiritual authority to do it. Now, we're not talking about Jesus' divinity here and his divine power, because he was expecting that the disciples would be able to do it as well. So it wasn't just something that was reserved for the Son of God. He had a full expectation that his disciples would be able to do this as well. But he uses this as a moment to say, this type only comes out by prayer and fasting. I think what Jesus is expecting is that the disciples by now wouldn't have just been into prayer a little bit and maybe no fasting, but they would have actually developed from the model of Jesus' 40-day fasting a lifestyle of prayer and fasting. It makes me wonder whether some spiritual encounters in our lives are reserved just for when we have done some prayer and fasting. And not just in a sense of like, oh, I might have a spiritual battle coming up, or I might have a power encounter coming up, I better do a bit of prayer and fasting. But we actually enter into a lifestyle where it's something we naturally and normally do. And so that Jesus would never say of us, you unbelieving people, this type only comes out by prayer and fasting, because we live in an attitude of being prepared all the time around prayer and fasting. Anyway, that's today's thought. empowerment to do greater things in the name of Jesus, because we're people of prayer and fasting. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, if it stirs a cup of conversation, can I encourage you to like it and share it on socials? Get on YouTube, become a subscriber, hit that button, and that'll be really great to get the word out there. Looking forward to day 25. I pray that you will be blessed greatly today, that as you consider prayer and fasting, or as you're in prayer and fasting, that God would really be just moving powerfully in your heart. Have a great day. See you for day 25.